Good afternoon, although we may be closer to evening at this point. My name is Tom Scott, and I serve as the Dean of Mercer's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second lecture in this year's Walter B. and K.W. Shurden Lectures on Religious Liberty and the Separation of Church and State. As has been the case in prior years, it is the privilege of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and specifically the Department of Religion, which Buddy Shurden chaired for many years, to host one of the three lectures. To hear more about the history of the lecture series and to introduce this year's lecturer, I am happy to welcome back to Mercer University the longtime General Counsel and Associate Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, Holly Holman. At the BJC, Holly provides legal analysis of church-state issues that arise before Congress, the courts, and administrative agencies. Her work includes preparing friend of the court briefs, including dozens for the major U.S. Supreme Court cases affecting religious freedom over the past 2 decades, issuing briefs for congressional staff, and making presentations to research institutions and religious groups. Holly, welcome back to Mercer.
Good evening. Thank you for being with us, and thank you, Dean Scott, for that kind introduction. It is my honor to be here with you all, to be back on this campus, and again to partner with the Shurdens in this lecture series. As Dean Scott said, I serve BJC and have for many years, and today I have along with me other BJC staff members. If they could just raise their hand: Jana Louie, Jonathan Davis, Lisa Jacob, and Carly Marshall. So if you have any more questions about BJC during our time here, please stop one of them. We enjoy getting to meet students and to talk about our work and what brought us into this work, and we are just really happy to be with you all. For those of you who are new to our work, BJC is an organization that for more than 8 decades has been dedicated to faith freedom for all, a belief that comes out of a historic Baptist tradition that we are all created in God's image, free in matters of religion, and that means that we have a certain responsibility to protect against incursions into religious matters by the state. And Buddy Shurden and Kay Shurden are great leaders and partners in these ideas, and they have shaped so many students and friends and part of their church community in the importance of freedom in living a full life. They established this lecture series 20 years ago. This is our anniversary, our 20-year celebration of the Shurden Lectureship. And they did so because they have this strong commitment to faith, freedom for all, to equality, and particularly understanding there needs to be room for different voices, many voices, for learning and understanding how we have to live out this commitment to freedom in different changing cultural environments in new ways, and that we're always listening and learning to do that. And speaking of learning, we have brought to you Dr. John Compton as our lecturer today, and many of you joined us for his first lecture just a little while ago, and if not, you can see it later online, where he delivered a lecture called Democratic Values in a Secular Age. And his next lecture that he will present to us today is called Secularization and the Rise of Political Extremism, something that I'm sure all of us have thought about and are concerned about and eager to understand more clearly so that we can be positive influences in avoiding the political violence and understanding that risk. Dr. Compton is the professor of political science and the chair of the department, the political science department at Chapman University in Orange, California. He received his BA in political science from William Jewell University, then a master's in international relations at Syracuse University, and his PhD in political science at the University of California in Los Angeles. The focus and primary area of his research and teaching is on religion and politics, as well as the Supreme Court and constitutional law and Congress. He has numerous publications in academic journals, as well as being the author of a couple of well-known and noteworthy books, including The End of Empathy, Why White Protestants Stopped Loving Their Neighbor. Also, The Evangelical Origins of the Living Constitution. And one thing that I found really interesting as I learned more about Dr. Chapman's work is some of the popular writings that you can find online. And I would recommend one, particularly that I noted, called When Did the Constitution Become a Religious Document? Something to think about. I'll tell you that that was actually written in 2015, so you'll see that some of these themes come and go through different times, and we really appreciate those who take the time to study and research and present their findings to us to help us better understand this world that we live in and how we can be activists to continue to protect what has served us well and to learn new ways of being free. So with that, let me welcome Dr. Compton.
Thank you, Holly, for the very kind introduction. And it's nice to see all of you here. It's great to be here at Mercer, and it's nice to see some familiar faces from the first lecture. And we had an excellent Q&A at the first lecture, and I had to answer a lot of the questions by saying, I'm saving that for the second lecture. So now it's time to deliver, unfortunately, or hopefully fortunately. So as I mentioned in the first lecture, a lot of this material comes from a book project called Untethered Belief: How Declining Religiosity Fuels the Culture Wars. So recent years have witnessed an explosion of mainstream reporting on the relationship between organized Christianity and right-wing extremism. And lest I be accused of hyperbole, here is a representative sample of recent headlines from major media outlets. Pro-Trump Christian extremists use scripture to justify violent goals. The far-right Christian quest for power. Architect of Project 2025 has close ties to radical Catholic group. The terrifying Christian nationalist crusade to conquer America. Trump or no Trump, religious authoritarianism is here to stay. With few exceptions, these articles and opinion pieces follow a simple formula. The reader is introduced to a religious leader, church, or movement with a well-deserved reputation for blending conservative theology and right-wing political activity. Popular profile subjects include the charismatic New Apostolic Reformation movement, conservative evangelical megachurch pastors such as Greg Locke, and the secretive Catholic organization Opus Dei. After examining the group's beliefs in some detail, the writer proceeds to interview disciples who are attempting to live out the creed in their daily lives. We meet ordinary Americans who believe themselves religiously obligated to vote for Donald Trump or to deport undocumented immigrants or to reorient the federal government to the enforcement of Christian principles. Often, these disciples warn of dire consequences should their candidate fall short at the ballot box. Sometimes they hint that violent measures will be necessary to defeat the demonic forces arrayed against them. Whether consciously or not, such accounts tell a causal story. Specifically, they suggest that far-right political attitudes are typically an outgrowth of theological creeds that are acquired through participation in organized religion. But is this true? Are conservative theological doctrines in churches really the most important source of anti-democratic attitudes in the U.S.? On one level, the answer is obviously that they are an important source. The pastors, churches, and organizations profiled in these articles really do exist. They are not fake news. And yet I would argue that the media focus on extremist churches and organizations has produced a serious misunderstanding about the nature of the connection between religion and political extremism. In short, as we saw in the last lecture, organized believers, those who are active members of a congregation, are on average more supportive of democratic norms than other citizens. But this does not mean that religion and extremism are unrelated. Believers with loose or non-existent ties to organized religion, those I've labeled untethered believers, are in fact more likely than other Americans to reject democratic norms, including the peaceful resolution of political conflict. Hence, while religion-fueled political extremism certainly exists, the evidence examined in the last lecture suggests that it's not primarily spread through organized religious participation. This lecture advances that argument in three ways. First, it asks why the myth of a strong connection between organized religious participation and right-wing extremism is so pervasive. Second, it takes a closer look at why some believers come to adopt extremist political views. After all, you may ask, if Americans are not acquiring extremist views in church, where are they acquiring them? Finally, building on other recent work by scholars of religion and politics, I'd like to argue for a paradigm shift in our thinking about the relationship between religion and political extremism. Specifically, I suggest we might consider the possibility that religion-fueled extremist attitudes originate in the first instance in individual-level psychological dispositions. Such attitudes may be nurtured or encouraged by charismatic leaders or networks of like-minded believers, but there's growing evidence that their roots lie in the individual psyche. If true, this fact has obvious implications for our thinking about how to mitigate right-wing extremism. In particular, it casts doubt on the idea that we can educate our way out of the current crisis of democratic commitment. If extremist believers are not, by and large, acquiring their political beliefs at church or through careful study of religious texts, then attempts to replace bad theology with good may have little impact on the overall prevalence of anti-democratic beliefs. So to begin with the first point, why is the myth of a strong connection between organized religious participation and extremist attitudes so pervasive? One reason, I think, is that scholars and commentators often fail to control for partisanship. A recent study from the Public Religion Research Institute, which puts out a lot of good research, concluded that, quote, authoritarian views are more prevalent among Republicans, white evangelical Protestants, and weekly churchgoers. The authors proceed to point out that 54% of weekly attenders scored high on a battery of authoritarianism questions as compared to only 38% of non-attenders. This may appear to be an open and shut case, but there is a problem. The relationship between religiosity and authoritarian or extremist views looks very different when we control for partisanship. We can illustrate this using a question from the 2024 Chapman Survey of American Fears, which I mentioned last time is a survey that Chapman's been doing for about 10 years, looking at the somewhat depressing topic of what Americans are afraid of. But as I also mentioned in the last lecture, we release it around Halloween, and it gets a lot of press. It's great for the university. But then we have to balance, how do you discuss fears, how do you compare fears of ghosts with fears of pandemics and, civil war or something, but it covers all those things. So the fear survey does not contain the full battery of authoritarianism questions. It does include a series of questions asking whether respondents believe that politically motivated violence is appropriate in some situations. One of these questions asks whether the use of violence to, quote, restore Donald Trump to the presidency is justified. About 12% of all respondents, this was in July 2024, agreed that violence was justified in this case. As one might expect, Republicans, younger respondents, non-college educated respondents, and those who reported being constantly online were more likely than others to support the use of violence. But what about religiosity? As can be seen here, aside from a slight dip among weekly attenders, support for a violent restoration of the Trump presidency does appear to increase with frequency of religious attendance, just as the PRRI study would lead one to predict. And yet, there are reasons to suspect this picture may be misleading. We know that Republicans and independents are more likely than Democrats to support restoring Trump to the presidency. We also know that Republicans are, on average, more likely to be regular church attenders. This should lead us to wonder, what are the effects of church attendance on support for violence when we exclude Democrats from the analysis? As we see here, this is the same analysis, but this time with Democrats excluded. Note that the previously positive relationship between religious attendance and extremism has turned negative. Those who attend church frequently now appear to be far less likely than others to support the use of violence to restore Trump to the presidency, whereas 27% of never attenders, people who report never attending church, support the use of violence. In this case, less than 10% of weekly attenders do. This finding obviously undercuts the theory that organized religious participation necessarily promotes political extremism. It also provides more evidence against the widespread assumption that current trends towards secularization are likely to reduce political extremism. At least among Republicans, an increase in the population of so-called nones, people with no religious attachment, seems more likely to promote extremism than to reduce it. Before closing the book on this question, we might want to look further at whether controls for common demographic characteristics would change this result, and the answer is that it really doesn't. If you do a regression model, religious attendance is negatively associated with support for violence in this case. But interestingly, religiosity is positively correlated. People who have a subjective sense of themselves as being religious are more likely to support violence. People who actually belong to a congregation and attend services are less likely to support violence, even after controlling for education, frequency of internet use, age, etc. So now again, you may ask, if Americans are not absorbing extremist attitudes at church, where are they getting them? And the correlation between frequent internet use, as you see here, and support for a violent restoration of the Trump presidency suggests one possible answer. While the media continues to focus on flamboyant megachurch pastors, the use of religious rhetoric and symbolism by ostensibly secular right-wing social media personalities has received less attention. Since 2023, for example, the New York Times has run at least 7 articles or opinion pieces on the New Apostolic Reformation network of charismatic churches. Precise estimates of this group's size are hard to come by, but the combined membership of affiliated congregations may be as much as 3 million. Now consider the much wider reach enjoyed by a group of conservative social media personalities who regularly employ Christian nationalist-style rhetoric. Former Fox News commentator Tucker Carlson has approximately 18 million social media followers and 3 million YouTube subscribers, and the third most listened to podcast in the US. Former Daily Wire commentator Candace Owens has 11 million social media followers and 2.7 million YouTube subscribers. Moreover, if one expands the definition of conservative media personality to include the likes of Joe Rogan or Jordan Peterson or Elon Musk, this group's reach grows considerably larger. Now, several of the figures just mentioned are obviously not conventionally religious, yet even apparently secular influencers like Rogan, Peterson, and Musk are increasingly framing their critiques of contemporary American society in explicitly Christian terms. In a February episode, for example, Rogan lamented that American society had become, quote, chaotic and effed up due to the decline of organized religion. Peterson, the psychologist and best-selling self-help guru, increasingly employs biblical stories in lectures and interviews. Musk, in turn, recently revealed in an interview with Peterson that he is, quote, a big believer in the principles of Christianity and, in fact, considers himself, quote, a cultural Christian. Given the expansive reach enjoyed by figures like Carlson and Owens, to say nothing of Rogan and Musk, there are good reasons to suspect that it's media and social media consumption, more so than Sunday morning sermons, that are driving some believers to the far right. Additional evidence in support of this hypothesis can be found in the 2024 Chapman Fear Survey, which includes a series of questions designed to measure respondents' propensity to defer to religious guidance when acting in the political realm. Specifically, respondents were asked whether they seek religious guidance when voting, whether the advice of religious figures should outweigh one's own feelings when making decisions about politics, whether religious leaders are a reliable source of guidance on political issues, and whether it's appropriate for religious leaders to provide political guidance to their followers. These questions were motivated by our suspicion that increasing numbers of Americans, including many who are not conventionally religious, are consuming political messages couched in religious terms. Hence, the definition of religious leader or religious figure was left deliberately vague. Although some respondents may have pictured a minister, priest, or rabbi, others likely pictured an online influencer, talk radio host, or podcaster who mixes religious and political advice. The 4 questions were then combined to create a single scale measuring an individual's propensity to defer to religious guidance when acting in politics, the deference to religious authority, or DRA scale for short. Here we have some basic descriptive data showing how different types of respondents scored on the DRA index. Republicans, non-white, non-college educated, and younger respondents were comparatively more likely than others to report that they seek religious guidance when making decisions about political matters. Not surprisingly, regular churchgoers were more likely than non-attenders and casual attenders to score high on the index. Yet our most interesting finding was that respondents with a strong propensity to defer to religious authority can be found across the attendance spectrum. As you can see here, about 27% of respondents who never attend religious services responded positively to at least one of the questions about religious authority. At the other end of the attendance spectrum, fully 45% of weekly attenders responded negatively to every single religious authority question, saying they don't look to religious figures to guide them about how to make decisions in politics. So at present, we lack data to settle, we don't really have the data to settle the question of who these non-attending respondents are referring to when they say they seek religious guidance when thinking about political matters. Yet it's noteworthy that Americans are increasingly using the label religion to describe activities that happen at home rather than at a traditional place of worship. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics' most recent time use survey, for example, about 60% of religious or spiritual activities now take place at home. Remarkably, the corresponding figure from 2003 was just a little over 20%. Clearly, not all this additional time is being spent in prayer or streaming online worship services. Rather, it seems the definition of religious or spiritual has broadened to include a range of quasi-religious activities, whether doing yoga or listening to podcasts on religious themes that might have been categorized differently in an earlier era. For present purposes, however, the interesting question is whether our religious authority index predicts anti-democratic or extremist political attitudes. And the Sphere survey data strongly suggests that the answer is yes. Here we see the results of a regression model with the dependent variable. It's an index of 3 political violence questions. Do you think political violence is justified to overturn unjust laws? Do you think political violence is justified to pursue political goals? And the question I just mentioned about restoring Trump to the presidency. The model includes controls for partisanship, gender, age, education level, as well as standard religion variables. The key takeaway is that individuals who score high on the religious authority index, the very top bar, were much more likely than other respondents to believe that violence is at least sometimes an acceptable way of advancing one's political goals. I have here just a couple of other examples of the connection between deference to religious authority on the one hand and support for intolerant or anti-democratic attitudes on the other. And we have a question, these are questions asking respondents, are you afraid of different groups? There's a question asking, are you afraid of illegal immigrants? There's a question asking just, are you afraid of immigrants? There's a question asking, are you afraid of Muslims? And a question asking, are you afraid of the U.S. having a non-white majority at some point in the near future? And the important thing to notice here is that deference to religious authority and church attendance almost always cut in the opposite direction. People who say, yes, I look to religious guidance in politics, were much more likely than other respondents to hold these intolerant attitudes. People who attended church regularly, on the other hand, were less likely to hold these intolerant attitudes. So these two variables cut in opposite directions, even after controls for the standard demographic characteristics are introduced. So now it's time to address the elephant in the room, namely the debate over Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism. I wish I had the Christian nationalism questions in the 2024 version of the Chapman survey so I could compare them with our religious authority questions. Unfortunately, it turns out there are like 10 professors involved in this project and everyone gets to jockey over what 50 questions are going to be included, and the Christian nationalism questions were left out. But I do have the Christian nationalism questions from an earlier survey. So in recent years, hundreds of academic and popular articles and dozens of best-selling books have advanced the theory that a loosely connected set of beliefs or doctrines, collectively labeled Christian nationalism, is fueling a rise in authoritarian and intolerant attitudes among white Christians. Scholars working in this area have developed a battery of questions, asking, for example, whether the U.S. should declare itself a Christian nation, or whether the government should advocate for Christian values, which are used to place survey respondents on a scale or index. And with few exceptions, individuals who score high on Christian nationalism also score high on measures of authoritarianism and intolerance. They are more likely than other respondents to have negative views of immigrants and religious minorities, for example, and also more willing than other respondents to favor authoritarian or violent methods of advancing political goals. This basic correlation has been replicated many times, including in the 2019 version of the Chapman Survey of American Fears. As can be seen here, support for deporting immigrants, subjecting Muslims to extra screening at airports, in opposition to the idea of a non-white majority, all rise sharply as one moves up the Christian nationalism scale from lower to higher levels of Christian nationalism. These findings are noteworthy since they may appear to contradict a central thesis of this lecture. Indeed, Christian nationalism is usually conceptualized as a coherent body of beliefs that are said to be acquired through participation in organized religion. The problem, we're told, is that influential religious leaders and groups have either strayed from the true gospel in their quest for power or else failed to purge their churches and denominations of inherited doctrines left over from a time when white Christians were less tolerant of racial and religious diversity. Hence, the usual recommendation one finds in the conclusions of books on Christian nationalism is that predominantly white congregations should look inward, engage in serious soul-searching, and ultimately bring about a reckoning that will purge their pews and denominational bodies of blasphemous doctrines. Now, it's not hard to see how one might arrive at the view that Christian nationalist doctrines are typically acquired at church. Although the number of explicitly political right-wing churches might be smaller than usually supposed, such churches clearly exist. Moreover, as we can see here, agreement with Christian nationalism does rise in tandem with religious attendance. Yet there are reasons to doubt this conventional story. First, the reported relationship between religious attendance and Christian nationalist beliefs is complicated by the failure to control for race. The fact that Black Americans tend to score very high on the Christian nationalism scale is rarely noted in popular articles or books on the subject. If we limit the analysis to white respondents or white Republicans, groups that are far more likely than Black Americans to hold authoritarian or xenophobic attitudes, then the trend line flattens noticeably, as you can see on the orange line here. Indeed, the fact that 56% of white Republicans who never attend religious services score high on the Christian nationalism scale should cause us to think twice before concluding that Christian nationalism is typically transmitted via organized religious participation. Second, we should remember that the underlying reason for the interest in Christian nationalism is the alleged connection to political extremism. We might therefore ask, how does religious attendance impact political extremism when we narrow the sample to include only high Christian nationalism individuals, people who scored at least 4 on a 7-point scale? If Christian nationalism and accompanying anti-democratic values are primarily transmitted through organized religious participation, we would expect a strongly positive correlation between church attendance and intolerant attitudes among this group. Yet, as we can see here, the relationship in fact runs in the opposite direction. High Christian nationalism individuals who never attend religious services are far more likely to hold intolerant attitudes toward immigrants, Muslims, and non-white Americans generally, than those who reliably fill the pews on Sundays. Once again, it's untethered belief that provides the most fertile ground for anti-democratic attitudes. As you see here, the drop-off really is enormous. In most of these cases, support for the intolerant position drops by about half between never attenders and weekly attenders. And again, we're zeroing in here on people who answer yes to most of the Christian nationalism questions. So having once again documented a correlation between untethered religiosity and political extremism, it's worth thinking more deeply about the nature of this relationship. Why are individuals with strong subjective feelings of religiosity more likely to embrace political extremism, especially when they do not participate in organized religious activities? One answer suggested by recent studies is that subjective religiosity and political extremism originate in the same individual level psychological propensities. For example, it's well established that people with high levels of self-reported religiosity are more likely to hold dogmatic views on social and political questions and less likely to be tolerant of diversity. This, of course, poses an interesting chicken and egg problem. Do self-reported feelings of religiosity lead to dogmatism in other spheres of life, or are dogmatic people more likely to have strong subjective feelings of religiosity? Evidence for the latter conclusion can be found in a growing number of studies which show that personal religiosity fails to predict extremist attitudes once controls for psychological dispositions such as authoritarianism, dogmatism, and the propensity to distrust others are introduced into the analysis. So the debate over the psychological roots of political extremism has clear implications for the Christian nationalism discussion. As one might easily guess from their titles, books like American Idolatry, Baptizing America, The Flag and the Cross, The Religion of American Greatness, most books on Christian nationalism take the form of exposés. Such books typically aim to provide church-attending Christians with the analytical tools to recognize whatever symbols, arguments, or forms of rhetoric the author associates with Christian nationalism, as well as biblical, theological, and moral arguments that can be used to combat or rebut Christian nationalist appeals. Efforts to police heresy are, of course, a normal part of any healthy religious community. I mean, we don't want them to go too far, but I would argue that all religious communities have to police their beliefs. And critics of Christian nationalism are no doubt correct in denouncing hyper-patriotic, blood-and-soil type beliefs as heretical. Moreover, at a time when MAGA-aligned churches and religious movements seem to dominate mainstream media coverage of religion, educational campaigns focused on Christian nationalism play an important public relations role. They remind Americans that overtly political and extremist churches are hopefully the exception rather than the rule. Yet even if such efforts succeed in keeping mainstream churches free from the taint of Christian nationalism, there's little reason to suspect that they will tamp down such attitudes in the wider society. As we've seen, untethered believers, not regular church attenders, are the most likely Americans to hold extremist views on questions about immigration, religious minorities, racial and ethnic inclusion, and political violence. Add to this the growing evidence that anti-democratic or authoritarian attitudes originate in individual-level psychological dispositions, and it becomes clear why educational efforts channeled through institutions where Christian nationalists are already in short supply are unlikely to succeed in mitigating political extremism writ large. To paraphrase an old saying, you can't reason someone out of a view they never reasoned their way into the first place, particularly when the person you're arguing with isn't likely to be in the room. So in conclusion, how should we combat religion-tinged political extremism if not through educational campaigns that expose such doctrines as heresy? And again, I think there's definitely a place for such educational campaigns, such as the ones that the BJC has been involved in. Like many social scientists, I'm admittedly long on diagnosis and short on cure. However, I'm convinced that any successful effort to slow the growth of anti-democratic beliefs must begin by acknowledging that what we face is not so much a crisis of theology or democratic theory, as much as a crisis of civil society. As we've seen, poorer and less educated Americans are more likely than college-educated professionals to embrace authoritarian or anti-democratic political beliefs. Not coincidentally, poorer and less educated Americans are also far more likely than college-educated professionals to say that they lack opportunities for meaningful civic engagement. They're less likely to join membership groups, less likely to volunteer, less likely to have access to public spaces like libraries, and less likely to enjoy close relationships with their neighbors. What's more, as Daniel Cox and Sam Pressler have recently shown, the class divide in civic engagement cuts across racial categories. Among both white and Latino Americans, those with college degrees are about 3 times as likely to report current group memberships as those without. Among Black Americans, the ratio is roughly 2 to 1. Remarkably, unions and churches, the traditional sources of connectedness for less educated Americans, as Cox and Pressler put it, are now more likely to serve college graduates than those without a college degree. Given the extent to which less educated and lower income Americans have become cut off from meaningful forms of social connection, it should perhaps come as no surprise that so many of them, whether white, Black, or Latino, are drawn to podcasters and internet influencers who tell a straightforward, us versus them story about all that's gone wrong with 21st century American society. The growing class divide with respect to civic engagement thus highlights an uncomfortable fact. In short, those of us on the upper end of the socioeconomic spectrum are writing, publishing, and purchasing books and articles on Christian nationalism, on fascism, on other anti-democratic ideologies at an incredible rate. Yet because of the aforementioned class divide, we're mostly preaching to the converted. The odds that a right-leaning, non-college educated American will pick up a book on Christian nationalism are pretty slim, and the odds that she will be converted to a more tolerant worldview after learning that a credentialed college professor finds her current beliefs morally abhorrent is even slimmer. With this in mind, we might consider redirecting some, not all by any means, but some of the energy currently being poured into purging upper-class left-leaning institutions of extremist or anti-democratic doctrines. Instead of publishing still more material on the threat of fascism or other anti-democratic ideologies, academics, activists, and ministers might instead work on the problem of how to rebuild our broken civil society. Those of us blessed with ample opportunities for civic engagement might ask hard questions about why the same opportunities are not available to those on the lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. We might even consider whether popular framings of the current crisis of democratic authority are not alienating precisely the people they are supposed to reach. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure. Yeah, this one's on. Great. So my name's Jonathan. I'm with BJC, and what I'm going to try to help do over the next time we have left is to facilitate Q&A with Dr. Compton. We thank you so much for that brilliant lecture. If you have a question and you want to write it on one of the Post-it notes that you received, if you didn't get one, there are more at the back of the room, and you could pass that to the aisle, and we can do the Q&A that way. So I'll give you just a minute to write. I see some of you writing right now, and that's a good thing. So just take a minute and reflect. If you have a question, feel free to jot that down on the Post-it note, pass it to the center, and we'll come around and pick those up, and we can go through them. Also, for those who are joining on the live stream, you can put your questions in the chat, and I will get those questions texted to my phone, and we'll go back and forth between a question in the room and a question on the live stream if there's enough to do that. So I have a question based on some things that you were just talking about, and I'm buying time here so that people can write their own. But if some of the fundamental ways that people find connection in civil society have broken down, what are some practical things that folks like us in this room can do to address that in our own communities, in our own contexts, wherever we're rooted?
Great question. I wish I had answers.
That's a fair answer.
Long on diagnosis, short on cure. But I think one thing we can do, I really believe, and it's sort of hinted at here, is think more about how to invite people into civic engagement, into spaces that where people who disagree with us may be unlikely to want to join us. I think if we lead with some of the types of ideas I just mentioned, if we come on a little too strong with the protecting democracy type idea, all you're really doing is telling people who disagree with you, don't bother coming in the door. This is not for me. I think that's one practical thing we can do. There's actually a lot of interesting ideas floating around right now. I think people are starting to latch on to this program. There have been 2 articles just published in the past week. Pete Davis, who I don't know, but he made an interesting documentary on the work of Robert Putnam, the famous civil society scholar. And he published an interesting article on this question, and then another person published an article proposing that somehow political parties could start to function as agents of civil society at the local level. I'm skeptical of that idea, but at least it's an idea. People are starting to think about this, and I hope we'll see an explosion of again, redirecting some energy toward that question in the next couple of years.
Thank you for that. Is anybody done with your Post-it notes? Could I get a few of our staff to maybe help collect those? And I see some right here. So I was thinking about handing these to you, but I'm just going to keep them and read them. So, all right, here's one. It's a lot, maybe some of the lines of the question I asked, but regarding the crisis of civil society and the notion of less civic engagement, is this more prevalent in more rural areas or urban areas, according to the data presented? Is there any sociological indicator that or data point that indicates there's any kind of a measurable difference or meaningful difference there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the real divide is a class divide. Poor rural areas really suffer in the civic engagement department, and poor urban areas also suffer. So I think it's like everything else these days. It's polarized along educational lines. It's polarized along class lines, and I really recommend this report, which just came out a month or 2 ago from the Survey Center on American Life, that it's just a 30 or 40 page report with lots of excellent graphics, and it really breaks this down by class. And whether you're talking about access to, well, this is broken down by race and class here, but this is broken down by class, whether you're talking about access to a library, access to a park, even something as simple as having neighbors who you have a relationship with that you could go and talk to or ask for help, the divide between non-college educated people and college and above is just really stark. I mean, it's a chasm, and I think it cuts across the rural-urban divide. To answer the question.
And it's kind of a follow-up to that question. It's a bit more technical, but there are some political science folks in the room and folks interested in demography and things. How are these surveys that have the data that you show, what are the controls for those, and what are some of the methodologies that are behind that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the Chapman Survey of American Fears is now in its 10th year. It was started by 3 of my colleagues, and then I joined it for the first time this year, but it's done by SSRI, which is a major pollster. It's a nationally representative sample, which costs a lot of money these days. It's hard to get people to, to respond to surveys. But it's a really well done, rigorous survey, and as far as the specific models that I showed, the point there is just to say, if we're going to say this religion variable matters, then we need to also control for other things we know that matter, like education level, partisanship, gender. So the models you saw had all the standard demographic controls. Yeah. Do we have a question out in the audience?
That was my question.
Oh, yeah.
I'm actually a religion professor, but I did major in political science in college. But I want to know, how is the data obtained? The methodology, how are you conducting the survey?
Yeah, so, yeah.
Yeah,
so-
I'll
right.
repeat that. How was the data attained
Yeah.
in the surveys?
So we contract with SSRI, which is a major national survey organization. They do, I think, most of CNN's polling. And because my 3 colleagues started this and have been doing it for 10 years, I'm going to punt on your question. But I believe what they have done, and if you go to the Chapman Fear Survey page, it's all spelled out there. So I reserve the right to completely take back what I'm about to say. But I think that what they have done is they have assembled a panel of people that they can repeatedly survey. And this is getting to be a huge problem, as you know, because no one answers their phone anymore, right? 40 years ago, anyone could do a nationally representative poll just by getting a random digit dialer. You dial 1,000 people, you've got a pretty accurate poll. These days, no one answers their phone. So people are doing a combination of online polling, or you assemble these kinds of panels of people who agree to get paid to do surveys every so often. And I believe that's what SSRI does. But as I said, I reserve the right to take it back, since I just jumped on this project at the last minute and I did not carefully study how SSRI does it.
Thank you. So here's one. What do you hope? We've got a lot of college students. We actually have a group of high school students over here. That's pretty cool. It's a history club from a local high school. Thank y'all for coming. Everybody wave. Hey. So I love that this is a multi-generational room, because it impacts all of us in different ways. But the question is, what do you hope that young college students, and I might add high school students, would get or take away from this lecture? And the second part of the question, or the second question is, and how might Trump's reelection affect or impact white Christian nationalist goals and visions?
So,
what's the takeaway?
Yeah.
And how might the new season that we're in impact white Christian nationalism moving forward?
Yeah, so I mean, on the first question, I'm going to sound like, a scolding parent or something. I have a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, but, the evidence on, getting all your news through social media. I cut out a couple slides on this, but it's amazing how many people now get all of their political news through social media. And it skews a little younger, as you might expect. And we're just beginning to study this, but it really looks like the implications of that are not great. If you're getting all your news from social media, that's a bubble that's filtering what you're seeing. So I would just urge people to try to seek out a broader range of sources of information. And in keeping with the theme here, get involved, get outside of your bubbles where you can meet other people and organizations, and maybe even meet people who disagree with you, who don't have the exact same beliefs that you do. I think that's one of the best things we can do for democracy going forward. on the question of, it was Trump's election and support for white Christian nationalism, right? Or was that the...
Well, it was what might Trump's election mean for like the vision of white Christian nationalist movements and maybe what their strategy might be moving forward?
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, the thing,
How long do you have?
Yeah, right. We've been through 4 years of this before, and the thing that's difficult to parse with Trump is he often says one thing and makes lots of promises, and then gets in office and just sort of loses interest or doesn't do much. My sense is that in his previous term, he made more promises in that direction than he delivered on. And I think that may be what's happening here. And I think you're seeing a certain amount of disillusionment on the part of right-leaning religious groups. I mean, Trump ran from the Dobbs decision in this election. I mean, he ran in the opposite direction, refused to stake out a clear position on the Florida amendment, a couple times referred to himself as basically pro-choice. So, I mean, I know I'm shocking everyone in the audience, but it seems like he may not be firmly principled on some of these issues. So, I mean, I think it's sort of anyone's guess whether he's going to prioritize the policy priorities of the Christian nationalist type groups, or whether, he doesn't have to worry about re-election. So maybe that's a reason that he would prioritize those types of policies, but I think it remains to be seen.
Good. So thank you for that. There are a lot of different approaches to talking about Christian nationalism, religious nationalism in general, which is not necessarily always Christian. And so the question actually involves one of the BJC programs, the Respecting Religion podcast, which Holly, by the way, is one of the hosts of. So it's a cool podcast. If you haven't heard of it, I would commend it to you. The question is the BJC podcast the series on Christian nationalism, is the podcast, and I would maybe think more broadly too, and other kinds of things like that, is that an effective approach in your view to combating something like Christian nationalism?
I think it absolutely can be. And, as I just mentioned, we're seeing, podcasts are another common source where people are getting political information now. So it absolutely can be. But again, I think a lot of it depends on packaging, right? So I think we want to package these things in ways that welcome people in, rather than, putting a big sign on the door saying, this is not for you. This is an internal conversation. And having talked to Jana and some other BJC folks, I think that they're aware of this issue. And so I think a lot of it is just thinking about, if the goal is really to reach people who don't already agree with us, how do we do that? So I think a lot of it's about tone, a lot of it's about how things are packaged. So, but I think podcasting, as we saw in the numbers here, it's clearly a more and more important source of information about politics for people.
It's called Respecting Religion.
Respecting Religion. Did I get it wrong?
So
Yeah, I got it. I was like, oh,
and that will not alienate anyone, right? That will not alienate
It is
anyone.
called Respecting Religion.
But it's a turn off, it's a double meaning. We want to be respectful of religious differences, as well as that language in the First Amendment. So that's an effort to bring people in.
Yeah, and in terms of its effectiveness, I would say too, it reached a milestone this year with the 10,000th download of the podcast, and in the last 48 months or so, or really in the last 24 months, the last 2 years, the listenership of the podcast has grown 250%. And so I do think that approach can be an impactful thing, and obviously people feel drawn to it, and somebody's getting something out of it. So.
And I think the question may have been, there is a BJC series on Christian nationalism.
More narrowly on the podcast, yeah.
Variety of different approaches, as Dr. Conlon was saying, different ways of understanding and coming to it. That's a good resource to consider in the topic and what it means.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't see any more Post-it notes. We've kind of surveyed both sides of the room. I'm going to check my phone to see if there are any lingering questions coming from the live stream, and I don't see any. So I'll close by asking the same question that I asked you last time, because we have some of the same audience members, but quite a few new folks tonight that weren't at the first session. Tell us the name of your most recent book, and give us the elevator speech about what that is and why we should get it.
The book that this comes
Yes.
from, or the previous? Oh, okay. Yeah, so the book title is Untethered. It's not out yet, but the project is called Untethered Belief, How Declining Religiosity Fuels the Culture Wars. So the material from today is from that project, and then the last lecture tomorrow at the School of Theology. We looked at the right-wing belief today. Tomorrow is going to be looking at how secularization is impacting the left in America, how it's impacting the Democratic Party coalition. I think it's a big force that's starting to fracture the Democratic coalition a little bit. We saw huge shifts in voting behavior by different groups in the election that just happened. So we'll be talking about some of that tomorrow.
And has your publisher told you yet when people can pre-order the book? Do you have any?
Sadly, no. These things
Okay,
take
just
forever.
checking.
As the academics
they do,
know, these
they
things
do.
take forever. So
Just checking. If
tune
there's
in
any
in,
more
like,
information, we can give
2029
people.
or something.
Fair enough. So at this point, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Compton again. And I'll invite our Chief of Staff for the BJC, Jana Louie, to come and give us some closing remarks.
Thank you. And again, thank you very much, Dr. Compton. We had talked earlier about how academics don't often give the practical pieces, but I do feel like you have given some practical ways for us to think and engage as a society so that we can protect democracy moving forward. So thank you very much for that. I do want to say thank you again to Dr. Brumley and also Dean Scott for your hospitality and hosting these lectures, and in particular in this, the College of Arts and Science, or Engineering, sorry, here for the second lecture. So thank you for that. And just as a final way to close off, at BJC, I do want to offer a couple opportunities to engage in addition to joining this last lecture on talking about the American left. We spent some time talking a bit about Christian nationalism, but the third lecture is also live streamed, so please feel free to join even though it's in Atlanta tomorrow. And also, for those who might be interested, BJC does offer internships, usually for those in college and also afterwards, to engage with us and join in the ways that we're trying to help protect our democracy and engage in civil society in a productive way. One of our key campaigns, as mentioned, is the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, where we're hoping to build communities that will help participate in our democracy in a healthy way. So thank you so much for attending. We're so grateful that you're here joining in this conversation with us. And yes, so many interns in this room, including, I'm just speaking here for the live stream, including Mercer's president, Underwood, was a BJC intern. And so and also some of our staff members here, both Carly and Holly, were BJC interns in the past. And so we've seen, and Elizabeth, yes, a law student here at Mercer as well. So we welcome you to join us. We have internships through the summer, fall, and spring terms. So you can find more information on our website at bjconline.org. Thanks, everyone.